The world faces a confluence of crises: climate disruption, resource depletion, loss of biodiversity, food insecurity, seed industry consolidation, dying oceans. Fixing the global food system would make one of the most significant contributions to mitigating many of these calamities. The world currently produces more than enough food for everyone on the planet to live a healthy and nutritious life. In fact, the UN tells us that there is about 2,800 kilocalories per person per day available. But the global food system is deeply inequitable. Roughly 11% of the global population went hungry in 2016, according to the UN. Moreover, most people don't understand how food justice and food security relate to social justice and environmental justice.
The social justice piece is front and center, and it shouldn't be considered secondarily. We are looking at communities of color being disproportionately impacted by the food system, and they are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. So farm workers, communities of color in high-density urban environments are really on the front lines, and so that piece, the equity piece, is actually the most important piece from a social justice frame, but also just from a good policy frame. And if people could start to answer the question of how are we going to help people there first, I think it would go a long way to making a difference.
So in 2008, I ventured out to Santa Cruz, like you said, to a program called CASFIS, the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food System, to learn how to grow organically. And for me, it was a bit of surprise, first of all, because they have certain degrees of farming. They have a large farm, they have a community garden, and they also have an orchard. And so when I first got there and I saw this huge organic farm, all of a sudden trauma sort of surfaced, believe it or not, as a woman of color. Because I heard back in the day about our relationship as black people to farming, that it was slave mentality, slave labor, and sort of those negative things started to really surface, that I felt that I didn't belong, that, why am I here? And it wasn't until I said, I have to face my fears and put my hands in the soil. And once I knelt down at the farm and put my hands in the soil, I felt this sense of belonging. But what I got out of that program is that not only did I learn how to grow organically, but I started to question the food system, because as we went around to various farms, the question that I asked is like, where are the farmers that look like me? And so really taking it upon myself to do a lot of investigation about black farmers in the United States, and was really taken aback by looking at my own state, New York State, to find that out of 56,000, at that time, 56,000 farmers, only 116 were black. And then looking at the census as various states here in these United States, to find that the numbers are dismal. Some states don't have any black farmers. And the fact that I felt compelled to say something about it, because if no one took notice of that number, those problems, I would eventually see that and forecast that within 10 to 15 years, there'll be no black farmers, and then we'll have one race of people controlling our food system. So I went back to New York, guns a-blazing, and really started with a group of my friends, the first Black Farmers in Urban Gardener Conference in 2010, to sort of talk about the plight of the black farmer and talk about the racial inequalities, the wealth inequalities, the land loss that has been happening for years around black agriculture and black wealth.
When you think about it, I think right now, currently about 98% of the agricultural land in the United States is owned by whites. And many black, especially Southern blacks, were forced or tricked out of their land over the years, or didn't have access to the same sorts of subsidies and support the federal government offered farmers. And so slowly but surely, we were removed from the land. And now since most of us have become, or a lot of us have become urbanized, we are looking to how we can do a couple things. Not only become urban farmers and provide access to local food, but it's a much more practical way of providing open space, right? Because it's productive open space, and so we're finding, but it's also building entrepreneurial skills. and a bunch of other things. But it is clearly a movement today.
We have focused our reporting on rural America because if the 2016 election showed us anything, it's that there is an incredible rural-urban divide. And yet there are so many stories of success in rural America. If you look at the very first presidential debate, it was the Heartland Forum in Iowa, and it was really looking at ways in which these presidential candidates know that the center of our country is in fact the center of what we are doing, what we're producing as farmers, but also where the politics lie. So our coverage has been on every issue that you could imagine that touches farm workers and agriculture. It's about opioid addiction in farmland. It's about rural communities struggling to talk about climate change, which heretofore has been taboo, but now they're faced with incessant flooding and other climate-related damage. I think the most beneficial piece to our rural reporting project is that we're able to narrate a conversation that many people haven't been willing to listen. And our job really is to listen. Our job is to really hear what's happening on the ground, not just from conservatives or progressives, but really from people who are facing or fighting factory farming in the Midwest, from communities that are fighting pesticide degradation, and really communities who are trying to change the face of rural America in a positive way. And that's really been our privilege to be able to tell those stories.
By 2050, with the global population expected to reach 9.8 billion, our food supplies will be under far greater stress. Demand will be 60% higher than it is today. But climate change, urbanization, and soil degradation will have shrunk the availability of arable land, according to the World Economic Forum. Add water shortages, pollution, and worsening inequality into the mix, and the implications are stark. The urban farming movement seeks to bridge this gap in food insecurity. The average American city needs to dedicate just 10% of its city limit area to urban farming to produce the entire recommended vegetable intake of its population. Urban farming is not a new phenomenon in the U.S. It was first adapted on a large scale on vacant lots in Detroit, Michigan in 1893, as promoted by its then mayor, Hazen Pingree. And today it remains an epicenter for the movement. During the Great Depression, over $1 million of produce was grown in urban settings. That's equivalent to $15.7 million adjusted for inflation in 2016. On a local scale, urban farming provides solutions to intractable problems of urban blight and violence, equity and food security, especially in low-income and underserved neighborhoods, areas some call food deserts, in inner cities across America. What have you learned about this movement and its impact?
I think urban farming is a critical component to the food movement and food systems. It's, in many countries, has proven to be one of the most important pieces of food sovereignty. Oftentimes, people like Miguel Altiera point to Cuba as an example of successful urban farming programs and projects. San Francisco was one of the first cities in the nation that actually created incentives for landowners to have urban farming. I think often overlooked are the social and economic benefits. There's a communal aspect to creating food security in communities where they have a lack of fresh access to food. So oftentimes these communities have been deemed food deserts. It's a term that's actually derided by many. Many prefer the term food swamp or food apartheid. In general, the concept of urban farming is about ownership in your community, about having access to land and access to food. So I think urban farming in general is a critical component to the food system. There are a lot of challenges to urban farming. We need more support for urban farmers, and at the same time we're seeing a tremendous amount of interest in very high-tech urban farms, so indoor hydroponic vertical farming that's receiving billions of dollars that isn't really aligned with the concept of what urban farming is about with respect to the economic and community benefits.
As a matter of fact, this month, October 25th to the 27th, we're having our 9th annual Black Farmers in Urban Garden Conference in New York City. And so we've been up and down from the north to the south, from the west to the Midwest, really taking on the issues that affect the black community and black agriculture as well. And it's been a dream of me. I'm very spiritual, so I hear the ancestors that are really calling out for justice and really getting the message for so long that we've been asking for a seat at the table, but now we know that we have to make our own table and our own seats.
You've spoken a lot about the idea of growing food with intention, and you started one of the founders of Rise and Root Farm. Can you talk about that and how you see farming as a spiritual practice?
Not only farming as a spiritual practice, but an act of justice, political justice and food justice, and an act of human right. And I say that because the two most precious things that we have on this earth is really food and water. And believe it or not, we live in the greatest country in the world where we grow enough food and we waste enough food to feed the people in this country, but yet we have hunger and poverty. You know, I got to think about that. 40 million people in poverty. Why is that? And a lot of it is based on the power structure in the food system and how we have allowed a handful of corporations, mostly white men, to not only control our food, but our water, our seeds. And for so long, we've taken it back. We've been complacent. And so starting Rise and Root with my friends, we all come from urban farming background, was a statement of how, as women of color, as white women, as LGBTQ women, how do we move this food system forward that has our faces, that has our voices, but in turn really promote what food justice should look like and be. If you look at the agricultural system globally, the foundation are women, but yet we're not recognized. We're not given the technological assistance that we need in terms of education and resources, but yet we have those numbers, and so something has to change. And through Rise and Root, what we're trying to do is just get that message out that we as women are a force to be reckoned with.
Everybody's at the table, and everybody's opinion.
Poor, white, black, brown.
Because there's strength in diversity. I mean, that's nature, right? And
biodiversity.
There's biodiversity. And I actually would also point out that the Bucky system is basically, when Norman Cousins, Saturday Review, met Bucky one day was all excited, and Norman Cousins said, "Well, what are you so excited about, Bucky?" He says, "I've just discovered nature's coordinates." And Norman Cousins said, "I think he did." His synergetic geometry is based on how he sees, he says nature is ultimate technology. And if you look at nature's strategy, and he could use all sorts of examples. He says, think about a tree limb and hundreds of pounds and with load on it and winds blowing. Why doesn't it just break? And it's hydraulics. And then he sort of said the other principles. He said there are principles. Nature never pushes, nature almost always pulls, because materials are stronger in tension than they are in compression. So he said, think about how does a tree, using a tree analogy again, get water from the ground all the way up to every leaf and tip. It's evapotranspiration. It's pulling the water, right? And so over and over and over again, you can see that nature has the models, that if we could not mimic them, but use them as models for designing human support, then we're going to figure out how we can do more with less support, more people life support, without infringing upon each other and without undermining and without undermining ecological integrity.
That's wonderful, wonderful vision. So I'm now going to ask you a question I'm asking everybody, which is, what is your idea of a Green New Deal? What would that look like? What would be your priorities?
Well, I would start saying that there's been a lot of discussion. It seems to have been sort of an inside job a little bit. So my first thing would be we need to open it up a little bit and get input. Just even from the Bioneers this week, I've talked to people who said, we're doing things that could probably be of help, right, and support the Green New Deal. So the other part for me that's really important is that there are a lot of goals, there are a lot of targets of things we want to do. We've got to focus on it. There's the what and then there's the how. As you can, and I'm a how person, right? And figure out what that means. But I also think it's got to be a systems. We need to develop and put a systems lens around it. And I think because I'm listening to a lot of what's being proposed, and I think the tension, some of the tension is that it's broad in many respects in terms of what it covers. And in our roundtable yesterday, one of the concerns were, but maybe not deep enough on climate, broad in terms of other aspects. And they do all interact, but I think a more systems dynamic sort of view of it could start to uncover the strategies that would allow us to meet both of them. But I do think, I'm a firm believer that you've got to look at how you do become more inclusive. If you're going to build renewable energy technologies and infrastructure, then everybody's got to be included and benefit from that type of economic development. People of color, among others, who've been excluded in the past. So, no, we have to have those kind of conversations. But I think if we open it up a bit and had more input from folks who've had experiences about things, as you put it, what's worked and what hasn't worked, then we're going to cut a lot of time and a lot of frustration.
Funny, I feel like my dream has been coming true in the last few months, mainly because folks are starting to be less scared of something new and really embracing it as an opportunity to kind of get outside of their comfort zone. So, I won't name any particular unions, but some unions that folks think of as old school are really getting outside their comfort zone and investing time and trying to get their workers comfortable with the platform, and that's exciting.
What are some of the other programs that have been launched or have grown and evolved out of this? Project Good or any of the other ones you care to talk about?
So the three main things that we do, actually there's four, herbalism is one of those too, but the three main things that we do are the Urban Roots Garden Builds. We do another one that's called Edible Education, right? So when we were first starting, we were so green. We were so green, and you had this very idealized situation how we were just like, yeah, you just give people some food and they'll figure it out and all these things. So we set up this farm stand in another food desert area in Sacramento, and we had all this wonderful produce, organically grown, everything looks great, but we happened to be sitting where there's a 7-Eleven, there was another chicken place, I think, in the same place, and we're sitting out there for 2 hours, and people are walking right past us, right? Bam! I'm like, hey, we got fresh produce, I know you want it, right? And they're like, no. KFC, fried chicken, I try to have a conversation about a big gulp. I'm like, you know what's in the big gulp? He's like, yeah, it tastes good. So, but then something happened, and then this is how we started this other program is somebody came to buy some produce. Well, she was there. I was like, okay, we're ready. So she looks around, she says, kale? I don't even know how to prepare that. What is this? What is the kale? What is the eggplant? All these different vegetables. There's no way that I don't know how to prepare them. And of course, if I take them home and prepare them for my children, they don't like it, then it's wasted food. So it was at that point that Judith was like, you know what? We should start doing edible education. And so from that, it was, okay, now you've grown the food, you've got this food, then how do you prepare it healthy? How do you prepare it easily, and how do you prepare it in a way that it has taste so that everybody's going to like it? And so what we do is we do different types of cooking classes to where maybe it's at a local community center. We have classes that are specifically for youth, which we call Kids Camp. We also have our educational, our elders. So we have specific things for elders, where we sit down, and it's just a wonderful environment because we take about 2 hours and we cook a meal. But, we're talking, got music, everybody sharing stories about their food, et cetera, et cetera. You got children who are eating carrots, and if you can get a child to eat a carrot or one of those raw vegetables, then you're really doing something. So that's the foundation of all that. And so there are some models that we were looking at too. We've been to Berkeley to see the Edible Schoolyard Project. So
right
how?
Behind my house.
Okay, so then you know how to be able to integrate the classroom with the food at the same time, and the same with the gardening as well.
They build their science classes out of what the kids discover when they're gardening.
Absolutely. And
Project-based learning.
Project-based learning, absolutely. And that's another project that we do.
Talk about that.
And then last but not least, we talk about Project Good. So we have Garden Build Program, we've got Edible Education, and we've got Project Good. Good is an acronym for Growing Our Own Destiny. And what we do is we spend a summer with young people, and we spend 100 hours, 9 to 5, all plant-based, no meat involved. So not only many of these meals they're helping to make. They get an introduction to everything from starting seeds to transplanting to soil science and bed preparation, composting, looking at how the whole entire cycle takes place. So we talk about all that. And we go on field trips. We go places like UC Davis. We went to the Bee Sanctuary. We've been to the Bay Area, if you're familiar with a place called Spiral Gardens in the Bay Area, but they've got a bunch of free classes that they have. So really starting to get them involved in what food is about. And then we follow that up with saying, okay, here's why you don't have it in your neighborhood. So then we start to talk about racism in the food system. We start to talk about the fact of food production doesn't start with slavery, especially among black and brown youth. There's a stigma, right? We've had young people who got involved with gardening, really loved it, went home, talked to their parents, oh, that's slavery work, or oh, your great-grandfather was a migrant worker. That's not what we want you to do. You need to be going to college, those types of things. But we jump past all that because we go back in history. Right? And we talk about indigenous ceremonies and things that happen in Africa. You know, we use a lot of things out of the book Farming While Black by Leah Penniman, where she has many things about the ceremonial use of land, where you give that otherworldly value to this so-called menial work that we call farming.
It's a spiritual practice.
It's a spiritual practice. So when you start to infuse the young people with that, then they start to get it.
Again, I'm trying to help our audience understand how to think systemically, and one of the lessons I've learned is to look at capacity building capacity. So there's structural capacity, that's laws, ordinances, governances. There's organizing, that's building coalitions. There's human capacity, that's knowledge. There's material capacity, that's money. And then there's political capacity, which never gets talked about, but is a big part of the story.
It's a lot of social capital, to be honest with you. And going back to that building coalition, you want to know, okay, who do I need to be at the table to? I don't know how to do this, right? Necessarily. But I know what we're trying to do, and I know who I would need at the table to make it happen. And then you identify who doesn't want this to happen.
Right.
You got to, and it's because you really want to say, okay,
know your foe.
Know your foes. And so you start with that, and then you start to assess what resources do we need and what options do we have for acquiring those resources. And if you just sort of narrow it down to asking, begging, requesting money, it may not happen. But if you then sort of the systems part is, there are other resources out there in the community. It may be volunteer. It could be there are a whole. So you really do take sort of that all-encompassing sort of view perspective. And then if something, what Bucky would always say, and I think this may be difficult, he says you start with universe, and then you whittle down so that you don't inadvertently dismiss something that's relevant, but you're conscious about. Really, and let's face it, you start universe, you're going to whittle it down fairly fast, right? Because supernova are not going to factor into the urban farms, but you really then you get to this point where you're saying, okay, and then you start to make the dots and connect the systems.
When you're growing food, it's not just about the food, because we have children, and so at first we're forcing them to come outside, but then as they start to come outside, we start to work together. That's family bonding time, right? Now that we're growing this food together, then guess what? You want to cook the food together, right? So then we're having more family time. So then we're now eating outside. So we're now spending 75% of our time as it relates to food production, cooking, and everything else outside and together. And so with seeing that transformation take place, that's what caused us to say, 2011 comes, let's start a farm. Why? Because we're in the middle of a food desert. And not just in the middle of a food desert, but we call it food apartheid is what we're talking about now. And the reason why is because you use the word desert, it kind of seems like something natural, things happen. But food apartheid, the area where I live, is a redlined area. Not only is it a redlined area, but there's also a bunch of charter schools, low-performing schools. In addition to that, you have no access to healthy foods, fruits and vegetables. So then compounding all these things on top of that, along with things like gang violence and
Drugs,
killings and all that, you have an environment of people who are unable to care for things that are alive, starting with themselves. So we're having all this success in our backyard, but then the general community around us is not experiencing it. So we were like, 2011, let's take what we've been doing and the success that we've been having in our backyard and then take it out into the community, since we know that it works.
The transition to a new economy, when we're talking about workers, it's not just white men, it's not just white women, it's everyone in this country. And really, if you, that principle of all boats rise really only works if you plug the hole at the bottom, right? When the economy is in a free fall and unemployment is high, it's extremely high, almost twice as high for African Americans. So the transition needs to be led by the communities most impacted, and that's all around the country, whether black or white.
Well, I think the first thing to consider in policy, whether it's a Green New Deal or an ag policy in general, is that we pay too many farmers too much money to plant too much of the wrong thing in too many of the wrong places. So our crop subsidy system is vastly bloated. It's about between $13 and $16 billion a year to invest in corn and soy. Most of which,
excuse me, what's the history of that? Is that a relic of the New Deal? Is it something?
It's a relic of Earl Butz, who really, he was the plant, hedgerow to hedgerow, sort of notion of we're going to help farmers by lifting up farmers by investing in subsidies of foodstuffs that essentially become either ethanol or feedstuff for cattle, and not actually food. And it's not helping farmers. I mean, farmers are still really suffering. So the first is to really reform our crop subsidy system. The second really is to look at things that are sort of bubbling up right now. One is supply management. It's a system that's really helping Canadian dairy farmers. It's essentially price parity to help farmers have a minimum wage and not overproduce, which is leading to all sorts of problems, not just for farmers, but also things like food waste and additional greenhouse gases. And then thirdly, I would say, if I had a kind of a magic wand, I would say that really what we need is to take a serious look at true cost accounting of food. So we pay a very small amount of our household income in the United States for food. It's probably the smallest in the world. It's around 6.5%. If you're eating out for dinner, it's about 11%. Places like Japan and France, it's roughly about 13%. And places like Mexico, it's 23%. But that,
eating out?
No, household income on buying food. But that cheap food, back to your very first question, is coming at a very high price. And we are not paying for the true externalities of the food. So we're not paying for future generations paying down pesticide removal from water. We're not paying obesity and the public health crisis, exactly. We're not looking at cleaning up factory farming. All of those factors for this very cheap, overly subsidized food system have been internalized by all of us, and our future generations will be paying for that. So I would say employing true cost accounting would be critical to really shifting how and what we think about when we think about food.
We talk a lot about the Green New Deal, but the original New Deal really came out of victories that were garnered by the American labor movement back then, particularly the AFL. You have the stock market crash, 25% of the population is unemployed, another 25% is underemployed, so they're working 50 to 60 hours per week, 6 hours a day, or excuse me, 6 days per week. And so, you have this massive unemployment that's happened, but no real mechanism to take care of that. You have Hoover as the president during those early years, but he really saw the Great Depression as a mechanism of the market and really resisted public investment in favor of more business-minded solutions. He feared inflation. He feared prolonging the Depression by lack of investment. It was really Roosevelt who came in and pushed for all the public works programs because of pressure from the labor movement.
Urban farming offers Americans of all genders, races, and political ideologies a chance to take back control of their communities, allowing communities to thrive and grow.